Hi, my name's Dan Santat. I am the author and illustrator of a new picture book called After the Fall, How Humpty Dumpty Got Back Up Again. And I'm currently working on a graphic novel memoir called You Bad Son. When looking at the story of Humpty Dumpty, Humpty Dumpty really comes down to just the essence of one thing, and that is the fall. And I always like the idea of having to pick yourself up after an accident, like maybe if you're a kid who fell off their bike and you're learning to ride a bike, and it's a really scary thing to muster up the courage to get back on that bike and maybe learn to just get over your fears and anxieties. And so in the story, Humpty Dumpty is that character who has gone through a traumatic thing like falling off a wall, and I thought he would just be this perfect example of someone who has to get over their personal anxieties. And I think just writing the other half of that story made sense, because just to hear the classic nursery rhyme of sitting on a wall and then they couldn't put him back together again, the end, period, just didn't sit well with me. I wanted to have a third act for him that I felt could be a teaching moment for kids, and maybe inspire those with anxiety to possibly overcome their own.
That adds a whole nother perspective to the Humpty Dumpty book, which I thought was also very beautifully drawn. I thought it had this very nice, soft, comforting palette as I'm reading it. So I'm assuming that all just went in tandem, was to just kind of let the reader know, and I'm assuming child, adult, whichever, that it's okay. There's not this fast pacing. It's very gentle. Was that kind of the tone of the book that you were going for?
Yeah, I wanted to make it clear that there's a period in between falling off the wall, is that there's a moment of recovery, and this just trying to assess what is it that I want to do with my life. The big passion in his life is that he is up on this wall because he is a bird watcher. Like, watching birds is his favorite thing. So being on the top of that wall is the best place to watch birds. After the fall, he's too scared to go back up the wall. So he lives his life differently to avoid that trigger. But the subtle hints are that he doesn't want to get the cereal at the top of the shelf because it's too high.
Yeah, that was actually kind of a very powerful
right.
I thought was he wants it, but he just can't.
Right. He can't even sleep in his own bed because it's a bunk bed. And then there's subtle hints he misses being up on the wall, so you see him walking along the shadow of the wall, and then his reflection looks like it's on top of the wall when he's walking along the shadow. The other subtle thing is the seasons are a metaphor for the whole thing. So the whole story starts in the summer. He falls in the summer, and then when the fall comes, the leaves are starting to fall off, and that's when he's starting to get these emotional lows. And then he reaches emotional bottom in the winter, when he's at his saddest moment. He's realized he's probably never going to climb that wall again, but he fills the void by bird watching from the ground, but it's not the same. But then he gets inspired. He sees a paper airplane and decides to build paper airplanes, and so he builds this paper airplane in the spring, and then he throws the paper airplane, lands on the roof, and then that's when he comes to a crossroad and he realizes, I can live my life like this and just leave that paper airplane, or I have to go face my fear and get that paper airplane back. And it's spring and everything's back to life. It's a rebirth, and he decides to overcome that fear.
And how has been the reaction to people to the book?
I've been getting a lot of emails from people with anxiety.
Wow. So they've actually courage to actually write to you and tell them.
Yeah, just telling me their story and how important it's going to be for their classrooms and so forth. My wife was deeply touched by it. I dedicated it to my wife. She read the book, she cried, and then she got a tattoo of a I don't want to give away the ending, but she got a tattoo that was inspired by the book. I'll just say birds, and so she got a bird feather.
Now, or is it about to come out?
No. So now that After the Fall is finally out of the way, I'm writing this memoir. It's called You Bad Son, and the story is about how my parents wanted me to grow up and be a doctor, and how I wanted to be an artist. And as any Asian American can probably understand, is that there is a strong cultural push for us to either be a lawyer, engineer, or doctor. And so the whole story documents about my life in my senior year of high school and how I found the courage to go and like sneak out and take art classes and put together a portfolio and learn what real art was, all while I was trying to apply to colleges and while my mother was going through breast cancer. It's a very heavy story. And on top of that, I've taken the old poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I've broken it up in segments so that it interacts with my life. Like, it'll tell a passage of the Ancient Mariner, and then it'll show a moment in my life that reflects that passage, and then it goes back and forth to the very end. It's funny because I told myself I wasn't going to write this book until my parents were dead. And then my friend Jean Yang, who wrote this amazing book, American Born Chinese, we were at the Miami Book Festival, and we were waiting for our flight. So we were sitting down at the airport eating, and we were sharing stories because he was telling me his story. He's like, yeah, my parents wanted me to get into programming or engineering, and I did. But on the side, I did comics, and I told him my story. Like, oh yeah, well, I got into art school and told my parents on my graduation day. And I told him the whole story, and then Gene looked at me and he said, you should write that book. And I said, I don't think I have the courage to write that book because my mom's going to be mad. And so the kicker was that Gene looked at me and he said, there are a lot of Asian American kids out there that can relate to this, and they need to hear this story. It's heavy. Like, I'll write a chapter. There are certain chapters that I'll look at the outline and I'm saying, I'm not ready for this chapter yet. And then I'll go on and write that other chapter. I'll be on a plane flight and I'll be writing it on my iPad with my keyboard, and I'll just start crying. And then I'll just look outside the window pretending like, oh, St. Louis, you're so beautiful.
You're never tempted to like call her up and be like, do you remember that time when I did that? Or do you kind of sneak it around?
I take little subtle hints about things. Like I'll hear them in conversation and I'll be like, oh, what's that about? And I remember my mom and dad were talking about how they met for the first time. Because this was like, I had broken up with my girlfriend in college and I was really bummed out. And then my mom tells me the story about how she was a nurse at a hospital in Thailand and my dad was a doctor.
Oh my God.
And then, but my dad's play was like, I'm a doctor. And my mom was just like, yeah, and this place is crawling with doctors. He's like, do you want to go to the movies sometime? And my mom was like, I'll go to the movies with you if I can bring my friend. And my dad was like,
classic move.
Okay, we'll go to the movies with your friend. And so they started dating for a little bit. And then my mom, she moved to America because she wanted to make some more money because, you know, she wanted to bring some money to her parents. And so bye. I'm going to America. And so she moves to Brooklyn, New York. And she goes to Brooklyn, New York. She's a nurse there for like a year and a half or something like that. And then one day she's coming around the corner and my dad's standing in the hallway. And my mom's like, what are you doing here? And my dad's like, surprise, I came. I'm a doctor here too. And my mom was like, this is a little creepy. Like, why? Like, you came all the way to Thailand, from Thailand to Brooklyn. To what, for me? And my dad was like, you want to go out sometime? And my mom's like, no. And then she changes to the night shift. And then my dad changes to the night shift. And then And so then, remember, this was fresh after I broke up with my girlfriend in college. And I'm like, Mom, what is the point of this whole story? Like, what was it that you saw in Dad? Because like this whole story, it sounds like you were really annoyed with him. And she says to me, she's like, you know what? He wore me out. And I was like, that's the lesson I'm supposed to take from this? Like, look, do I love him? Listen, A for effort. So I'm an only child, and there's a lot of pressure being a little bit. Like, you're our only shot at being a doctor, and you decided you're gonna go into children's books instead.
But at this point, I think she's more than happy.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny because she's like, remember when I told you that you should go to art school? And I'm like, really? Is that how it played out? Like, you guys were like, yeah, we should totally.
She was being shallow. She was manipulated. It's all Thai mothers, you know.
Right.
They know everything.
Right.
They manipulate everything.
And it's like the phone calls now. It's just an hour of her venting. Like, you know what your dad did today? Like, he turned on the Golf Channel and then he just went to sleep and I couldn't watch my shows. And it's just like, I'd really like to talk about just your day. Let's just can we just have a fun conversation?
Especially if she's watching.
Right. And it's like, that's on top of that. It's like, your dad had the 1993 Masters golf tournament on. Like, we already know Tom Watson won. And yet he needs to see a rerun of it and then sleep in front of it.
So, I found out, I guessed correctly, that Mr. Santat is actually Thai.
Got it on the first try.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks I'm Chinese because of the eyes.
And no one knows I'm Asian.
But yeah,
so. Really forward to the memoir.
Thank you.
Most definitely. And then do you have any other projects that are in the works, the shadows?
I have a graphic novel that I'm doing with Scholastic called The Aquanaut. And the premise of that are these sea creatures find an old diving suit and then they turn it into a land walking device so that they can explore land in hopes of finding SeaWorld because they think it's going to be a Shangri-La where they can be safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sawadee ka. Kakun na ka.